Dylan, and welcome to the podcast. Thanks very much for joining us.
Hey, it's my pleasure to be here, man. How you doing?
Oh, I'm loving life and loving Christmas, to be honest. I'm an absolute sucker for Christmas, so my favorite time of year.
Yeah, my full confession here is I didn't actually really like Christmas till I had kids. And then once like their excitement carries everything.
Yeah.
And so this last weekend we drove from Colorado to back to my folks' place. It's a 16-hour car ride. And the whole time my kids are like, "Are we at grandma's yet? Are we at grandma's yet?" So as I'm talking to you, that's where I'm at. I'm at my parents' place, enjoying the Christmas break.
Yeah, absolutely love it. Especially in a year like this, we can just appreciate all the family time we can get even more. So that's great. But yeah, the reason we have you on today is to discuss that all important topic of how to do well in a job interview. So we can Google this as much as we like. We can, read all the blogs, but it's always better to actually have a chat with someone who has had to go through the experience a few times and has learned their lesson in a few failures, but also in their triumphs. So, um, I've already given the listeners a brief introduction to you, but if you don't mind just taking us through your professional career to date.
Yeah, not to worry. So I'm one of those people who went to university. I was told like, hey, just go and the job will be waiting for you. And that's a complete lie. So I graduated and I didn't know what to do. So I went into the mortgage industry right before the Great Recession. So you can kind of imagine, I did pretty well, not as well as I think I could have. Then one day I showed up and there's padlocks on the door because
No,
everybody went bankrupt overnight.
not ideal.
Yeah, so I had to pivot, and I pivoted into education with a brief interlude of how I paid for that as a completely different story. So then I taught for 8 years, and I taught in one of the bigger cities here in the U.S. in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But then, my contracts ended, no one was hiring, so I had to go overseas. So I taught in international schools in Taiwan for a couple of years, and then I taught, came back to the U.S. so my wife could go to grad school. And then while she was in graduate school, I kept teaching and realized that I was never going to make enough money to actually make ends meet at the end of the month. There was always too much month at the end of my money. And so I quit that job and I went back to school and I got my certified public accountant. It's a CPA here in the United States. And I've been working as that since. And during that process, when I was making the transition from teacher to accountant, that's a pretty solid, difficult track to take, especially when I show up at university. I was 35 at the time, and I had a professor look me right in the eye and go, "Don't even think about the big four firms. You're too old. They're not going to handle you." And I just looked at that and was like, "I'll show you." so so I actually ended up getting a job with the big four, but I had to learn how to do a lot of this interview, resume prep, networking during that time. And what ended up happening is that while I was at university, they're like, "Hey, you're really good at this." So I started counseling and coaching people on interview prep, how to write their resume, how to network effectively, and helping them get their jobs. And we had the gamut, everyone from your target audience of 18 to 21 year olds to people who are coming out of the military to people who are coming back to school for the first time in 30 years. And I worked with them all. And so that's really where that brings you up to present now. And that's where I'm at. I'm still working as an accountant. I'm a financial auditor for a Fortune 100 company. And I do this on the side with my own podcast and my own business.
Yeah, that's amazing, and it's quite interesting because you have transitioned between some very different career paths, and they all require different skill sets, and employers are looking for different things in different fields. However, my sort of first question to you would be, what are the universal qualities, uh, attitudes and attributes that are appealing to employers universally, regardless of profession? And how do you foster these so that you don't just turn up on the day and say you're these things? So you can foster these in your daily habits so that you will, regardless of what job you turn up to, you're just, the employer is going to go, perhaps you're not the most qualified, but you're the best employee. We can teach you, you are malleable, so to speak, in this role. And how do you effectively communicate that as well? I feel like sometimes in interviews you can go in and you don't want to put your best foot forward in a weird way of like coming across as too boastful, too
Mhm.
arrogant, and but at the same time we we also don't want to be retreating to our shell and turn up and be like, well, I might be the best candidate for this job. I don't know. What's your take on those?
Well, I'm going to just address one thing that you said about being boastful. So here's my question to your audience. I just would encourage everyone to actually think about this. What's the difference between conceited and confident? Right? If I come into you and I tell you that I can do X, Y, or Z, and I can say it with complete confidence, am I conceited or am I confident? And the difference between those two things is, can you back up your BS? If you can do what you're saying you're going to do, you're confident. If you're just blowing smoke, you're conceited. And so in a job interview, a lot of those questions, one of the things the interviewers are trying to determine is whether or not you're conceited or you're confident. And so if you can back up your BS, 100% be as boastful as you want, because you're not being boastful, you're just telling the truth. And I think one of the big barriers for any job interview candidate is people want to try to have this false humility because they're intimidated by the other person on the other side of the table. You don't need to be, and you shouldn't, because every interview is a two-way street. But to answer your question, more broadly, if there's one theme for all interview, this whole topic that we're going to talk about today, it's that your interview will be won or lost well before you ever sit down at the table, period. The skills that you're bringing to the interview have to be won, have to be honed, have to be learned before you show up. And so, when you're looking for, what's a universal skill? Well, if there's one universal skill that I'm going to say that every job, no matter what it is going to be looking for, it's salesmanship, period. Salesmanship. And let me give you an example. I learned salesmanship working in the mortgage industry. And so I had to learn how to handle people's objections to interest rates, mortgage terms, my competitors in the market, explaining to them, why this is the best fit for them. Well, then how does that transfer into teaching, right? So when I show up and I want to get a job as a teacher, and I say, well, I have all the sales experience. Well, how, it doesn't seem obvious until you realize that as a math teacher, I'm selling mathematics to teenagers and I have to get them to buy it. So right there, that was the number one thing I said in my interviews for teaching, is that I'm a salesman. And as a salesman, I'm going to get your students to buy my mathematics. And, again, what's the difference between being conceited and confident? I knew I could do it, and my track record showed it. I had 2 years back to back where 100% of my students passed their exams. That included my students from extreme poverty, my students off the Native American reservation that was right next to that school, my students with special needs and disabilities. Every one of them passed the standardized exams. How? I sold. So, if you're looking for one thing that you can hang your hat on, that is a quality that every job, whether you're an engineer, whether you're in sales, whether you're a stockbroker, whether you're a teacher, it's going to be sales. How can you convince somebody that you're adding value to their organization? And when you're in that interview, that's exactly what you're doing. You're selling yourself to them. So, beyond that, every employer, stop and think about it like a date. You're showing up, we're deciding if we want to make a commitment to each other. So what do you look like? What do you look for in that person across the table? You're looking for someone who's enthusiastic, someone who's gung-ho about your goals, somebody who's going to add value to your life, somebody that you're going to look at and go, when this person's present, I'm going to perform at a higher level. And so that's what you're looking, no matter what job you're applying for, that's what you want the employer to walk away with. What impression are you looking to leave them with? I wanted everyone to go, wow, if I had 10 of those guys, we would rule the market. And again, that goes back to that sales, but they're going to be looking for that enthusiasm, being gung-ho, looking to add value. And one phrase, and this is a money phrase that everyone can take to every interview, is find some way to tell the employer explicitly how you add value to their goals. And if you do that, it's going to stick in their mind, because all they're hearing is that cash register going in their head when you say that.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, I must admit, when you first said sales, learn how to, I was like, okay, I don't get it. But now that you've articulated it that way, that makes total sense. Like, at the end of the day, when a company is asking for potential employees to come and audition, so to speak, it's like, who's going to provide the most value for this company? Because, they are going to spend their valued resources paying you, taking up their time, and that if there's someone else who can provide a better quality of service or help make that company more valuable, and more likely to, resist market shocks or, whatever life throws at it, then yeah, you're going to be the ideal candidate. that's really good. I've never actually heard a perspective like that. So thanks very much for that.
Yeah, well, and it kind of goes back to the, I was actually talking to my wife, last yesterday when we were out walking one of the parks here, and one of the things that she brought up, and it's totally true, is that sales is part of every job, no matter what it is, right? And it really comes down to that whole transferable skills. When I was having a conversation with a guy at work, and he was saying, we're auditors. Well, how could I possibly get into, another section of the business? Because he doesn't want to be an auditor for life, right? He's like, how can I possibly get into this other section of business? And my wife has got the key, right? She says it's all about those transferable skill sets. So in her case, how does being a waitress translate to her being an excellent engineer at a national laboratory? And so, like, and stop and think about what a waitress is doing. A waitress shows up, and this applies to teaching too. If there's any teachers in the audience, they're going to totally hear exactly what I'm saying. But stop and think about what a waitress is doing. A waitress is dealing with an environment in which everything goes wrong, everything's on fire, nothing is happening right, and they have to make a whole bunch of people with very different views on how it's supposed to go, make them all happy. They got to make their busboys happy. They got to make their cooks happy. They got to make the boss happy. And we're not even into the customers yet, right? These people who are coming in and paying their money to have this experience, and you got to, did they have kids? Are they on a date? And of course, then that waitress is going to have to, okay, so they're on a date. Well, I should offer them a bottle of wine. If they got kids, well, I got to get the crackers, right? It's all about that experience, and they're all competing for that tip. So now let's think about how that would translate into the engineering world. I got projects and deadlines. I got different stakeholders. I got limited resources. I got bosses who have different priorities, and you're managing all that. Those same skills you learned on the floor of that restaurant are going to be applicable on the floor of your engineering firm. I promise you. And so just like sales transferred right over to education, when I was interviewing as an accountant, to be an accountant, and remember, my professors flat out told me, don't even bother applying for the Big Four. You're too old. They'll never look at you. So there's 4 of them. I got offers from 3 of them. How? When I walked into every one of those interviews, I told them, as a teacher, I learned how to do X, Y, and Z. I learned how to manage my projects, manage limited resources, deal with multiple stakeholders with conflicting goals and objectives. And I did so successfully. Look at my track record. I had 100% of my students pass the exam. Now, if you think that they didn't walk out of there going, that's our boy, you're wrong, because they clearly did. And so that's all about that transferable skill set. Whatever you're doing right now, you are learning a skill stack that is applicable to a broad variety of different things. And in your resume and in your interview, your job is to make them understand how that skill set is going to serve them.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. So with that skill set being the ideal goal, how do we foster that? How do you, rather than going through failure of interview, field interview after field interview, and hard lesson after hard lesson, what daily things, or what can we be proactive with in our lives to foster this skill?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like I said, if there's a theme here, it's that the battle for the interview is won before you ever showed up.
Yeah.
Right. So the question I have is, how are you interviewing every single day in your life? Right. So, to put this in perspective, I now work, I went through the Big Four, did the Big Four thing. I moved into, Fortune 100 company. I'm an internal auditor for them. And so like day one was figure out what it is. How do I be successful here? Right. Celebrate that I'm now here. I'm in this internal audit firm. Super happy with it. Day 2, what's the next job that I want, and how am I interviewing for that today? Right. So I know where I want to go. And so I'm looking at, how do I use my current job to hone the skills that job in the future is going to want to have. Now, if you're 18, you might think, well, I don't know. Okay, well, let's go back to that waitressing example. You go get a job at the local restaurant. I just gave you an entire list of skills that you can hone every single day to be ready for that interview. Did you do a good job managing your boss? Did you do a good job managing the tables? Did you do a good job with your project management? Or then take that into your life. Did you do a good job managing yourself? Did you do a good job managing your spouse or partner or your roommate or whatever? Did you have a good enough plan for the day that you were effective and you weren't stressed out for the whole day? And that's a great metric. People are like, well, how do I do good at my job? I don't know. How are you doing at your life? If you can plan for your job and project manage for your job, why are you not project managing for your life? And before this, I even showed you, I got a notebook sitting here on the table. I'm going to show it to your audience on YouTube. I've listed out what I'm going to say or what I want to say. Like, this is not an accident. These are things and skills that I've learned, but I also practice them in my day-to-day life. I get up in the morning, I make a list. How do I get to work? I get to work, I sit down at my desk, I make a list of everything I got to do. Those are transferable skills that you hone. And then when it comes time for the interview, again, I've won that interview. I can say, here's how I work. Here's how my process works. And this is why it's successful. Look at all the things I've done. And so, again, going back to my experience in interviewing for the Big Four, I had a partner, and I walked into the interview and I sat down and he goes, hey, I can tell that you're married. I don't wear a wedding ring right now just because it bothers my hands, but I was at the time. And he goes, you're married. I imagine you got kids. How are you possibly going to handle an 80-hour-a-week job with a wife and kids and not end up divorced? I mean, this partner flat out looked me in the eye during the interview and asked me that question. And I looked at him and I said, but I've been working 80 hours my whole life and I've been successful. I was able to woo this woman, have kids, and become a great father while being in poverty, working multiple jobs, and managing everything. And we are happier today than we were when we got married. But I could say that again with complete confidence, knowing that I had done it. But so how did I prepare that? Because I practiced it every day. There's a transferable set of skills that we practice every day that are applicable to our professional lives. And so if you're asking me like, well, how do I prepare for this interview? Start preparing with your life. Start building that skill stack. Start looking at how am I showing up today in preparation for tomorrow.
That is, wow. I've never heard, like, where is this type of stuff when I was in school and I was going, I mean, I've been very fortunate. I've only ever had one job interview for the maritime industry, and I've just been in that ever since. But certainly with my friends and work colleagues who have now left the company and gone on to other places, the job interview market, people, like, even if you're not in school, this is essential skills and an essential habit, actually, but it's intentional habits that we need to be proactive with every day. Be proactive rather than reactive. It seems to be the winning philosophy there. So my next question then is, you've described in your professional life that you've had to transition through various fields, and my question then is, what have you learned from various job interviews, and what would you do differently if you could do it again?
So to kind of work backwards with your question, I like my life right now. So the question of what would I do differently? I don't know if I would do anything differently because I never stopped moving forward, right? And that's brought me to a place I like. So if I'm looking back at it, I wouldn't want to alter that. So like, just kind of like on this high philosophy, temporal, messing with the timeline type of thing, I would be leery to say that I would do something different. But I can tell you that I've had interviews that have gone horribly, absolutely horribly, where I walked out and was like, living in a cardboard box is probably better than ever doing that again. And it comes down to me personally, and I learned this in sales early. This goes back to that sales. I hated getting caught flat-footed. If I was on a sales call and somebody asked me a question and I was flat-footed and I had no answer to it, my dedication, my promise to myself was that was never going to happen again. And so I would literally sit down and I would figure out how to answer that question in a way that was just, because here's the thing, people who are resistant, some interviewers are like this. Some interviewers are sadistic. They're going to ask you that gotcha question just because they like to watch you come apart. And I like to just shatter their little sadistic world by having the perfect answer. And so when I've had interviews where people have asked me that gotcha question, like, did I go and have a little pity party and feel bad about myself and beat myself up and maybe had a couple of, too many mozzarella sticks and too many pints of beer? Yes, I did that. And then what I did is I sat down, I wrote down that question, and I wrote down every response I possibly could have to it, because the next time that happens, I was going to nail that guy to the wall. And so, how do you learn? You got to have an after action review. Even if the interview went well, why do you think it went well? How did you feel about it? And it's when you start, and I can tell you all of this stuff, but if you interview a lot, you're going to start to see it. You'll start to know when you walk out of there whether you got the job or not, because of how they interacted with you. But you don't learn that unless you sit down and reflect on what that interview was, and then compare it with the feedback you were getting in the interview to the results at the end. And so like, I can tell you when I interviewed for my current job, when I literally, I called my wife as I was walking to the car and I said, honey, I got the job. And they're like, well, they offer you at the table? I said, no, but they're going to offer me more than I asked for. And I knew that because of how they acted in the interview. But the only reason I did know that is because I constantly went back and looked at it. And so this kind of goes to the, if you want to learn how to interview well, you got to give yourself plenty of opportunities to fail. So you have plenty of opportunities to think back at it. So if any of your audience is at a university, I don't care what university it is, I promise you there's a career office there. Go find the people in that career office, ask them, when are they having mock interviews? And then sign up for all of them, even the fields that are not yours. Right. So when I knew I went back to school, I knew I was going to be an accountant. I knew I was going for my CPA. I knew I wanted to be a financial auditor. And I did mock interviews for engineering firms. I did a mock interview to be a general practitioner for a doctor. I did several sales interviews. I did several teaching interviews. I just interviewed for everything in the entire university. And I got a couple different responses. People going, well, you shouldn't take those mock interviews with engineers. Dude, there was an open slot. I'm not going to just waste this guy's time. I'm here for me, not for that engineer. And if they didn't get on it, tough for them.
Yeah.
And what I learned was I had all these opportunities to practice.
Yeah.
And because there's nothing on the other end, right? There's no job. This is a pretend interview. I can just do I can audition plenty of different techniques. I can fall flat-footed and nothing bad's going to happen. And it's that type of opportunity. So now let's say that you're not in university. Okay, well, if you're looking for a job, apply for everything. Just start applying, even go to job interviews that you have no intention of taking that job and give it a shot. And if you're sitting there going, well, I don't want to waste this company's time. Look, man, I get that, but that company will waste your time without a second thought. This whole thing is transactional. That company does not care about you. And if they tell you that we're really a family here, they're probably a toxic family, and just plan accordingly. So like go and take it. This is for you. Go interview for you. And I've done that too, where I've been in interviews and be like, there is 0% chance I want to sell insurance. And yet here I am interviewing and giving them and practicing everything I've said. I'm enthusiastic. I'm telling them how I'm going to add value, and I'm practicing. And then that insurance interview was really funny because I went in there and I did the whole interview and I tried a whole bunch of stuff. And my goal in that interview was like, I'm just going to be the world's most enthusiastic applicant. And they offered me a job right at the table. But like, it dawned on me like, oh, I was trying to give really polished answers, and I came into this one and I was far more authentic. And that generated a job offer. Boom, right there. And so, how do you learn it? You got to give yourself plenty of opportunities to fail. You got to be okay with that failure, and you got to review it. Success, win or lose, you got to review it. Go back and think about the feedback you got. How did you perform? What did they do? And here's one other thing that I would say. Success in an interview can be a value game. And one thing I've learned is that, okay, you come out with the interview and you're like, hey, this is great. They're going to get back to me in 2 weeks. They might not. And why do you want to sit on your hands for 2 weeks? That interview's done, move to the next one, keep going until you have a job. And even after you have a job, if you still have interviews lined up, go to those ones.
Yeah, that's really good. So just a couple of things I wanted to touch on there, which was the after action review, which I've never heard for a job before, and failure. So I think we have this massive phobia of failure. I want to tackle that first. And I think you've already potentially answered the question, so to speak, of, don't be afraid of it. But how do you embrace it, so to speak? And how do you take that first step of getting into a job interview, absolutely falling flat in your face? It was a horrific interview. And how do you make failure your friend? How do you make it a teacher rather than a hard lesson?
So I'm going to draw again. This is sales experience, right? Like, if you want to be a great teacher, you go work in commission-based sales, because you're going to be in the bathroom with the stall shut, crying in the corner. I don't care how big or tough you think you are. That's going to happen. And it's happened to everybody in food service that I know. Right. Yeah. It's like that meme that goes around on Facebook of like, due to COVID and high volumes, only one person crying in the walk-in freezer at a time. I showed it to my wife and she's like, that's too real, and walked away. Right. So, clearly like stress is part of the game and learning to deal with it. And I'll tell you what, for me, made the difference. And I was really lucky that I had this early on in life, but on some levels I would have figured it out anyway, just because of who I am, right? The difference between someone successful and someone not is a successful person keeps doing, and then the failure stops. But I was in the mortgage industry, and I was having a bald month. I had no deals, nothing. I had nothing, and I was 100% commission, which means I didn't have rent payment, I didn't have food, I had nothing, and I had yet to learn how to manage my finances, which means I spent my money as fast as it came in. So I literally had nothing, and I was locked up in my office, and I was trying to make the perfect flyer for open houses. For the go to these open houses, the real estate agents were having to be like, here's my flyer, please give me business. And my sales manager sat down across the table from me and went, Dylan, no one gives a shit how much you failed. They only care how much you succeed. And your successes are in direct proportion to your failures. And I was like, I'm like almost in tears. So like this high-minded talk didn't stick. But his point, he got out a pen and paper and he just said, okay, Dylan, how much is a yes to you? How much money do you make on a deal? I said, well, I make about $1,500. He goes, okay. And how many times do you need to be told no before you get a yes? I said, 20 times. He goes, $1,500 divided by 20. And he comes up with the number and goes, every no is worth that amount of money to you.
Wow.
And I went, what? He goes, he's like, I just gave you an equation. He's like, you're a math guy. All you have to do is set your income as to what you want it to be, and then go back and ask yourself, how many no's do I need to get in a day when every no is worth $75? And I looked at him and I said, I can't do that. I can't handle the rejection. And he goes, yeah, but can you handle a big paycheck?
Yeah.
and I looked at him and he said, I don't want to hear it from you. Go out there and go get 20 no's a day. And so I did. I actually had a notebook in my pocket and I kept track of how many times. You know that during that time, I had a real estate broker threaten to call the police if I ever walked in his office again. I had somebody escort me out of their office because it was terrible. And the next month I made $14,000.
Wow.
Oh,
wow.
I had so much business. I had to hire a professional assistant to help me process everything. It was like magic. And it dawned and I've heard this comparison before. Like, I grew up watching Michael Jordan, right? Because I'm older than your average audience. If you're in the United States, it's LeBron James. And I don't even know if the audience in the UK would understand what I'm talking about. But like, Michael Jordan was a basketball player and he was famous. He was one of the most winningest basketball players in the world. And then if you look at his shot average, his shooting average is actually pretty bad. The difference, though, is that every time he had the ball, he shot. And so on a points per game, he had more points per game than anybody else because he failed more than anyone else. And then I can't remember what year it was, but he had this game-winning shot from half court, won the championship. Everybody, it's like the pinnacle moment of his career, but nobody remembers the other 80 times he tried it and missed.
Wow. Yeah. That's a great comparison.
So when you're asking me, like, how do you embrace failure? I don't want to fail. I want to be on the highlight reel. And the only way the greats got there was to fail a lot. So how much is that failure worth to you?
Wow. Yeah.
I'm in a position where I've made more money this year than I've ever made. My net worth has increased over the last 12 months by $60,000. And I got there because I was willing to fail. And the other people I went to school with who were afraid of failure are working dead-end jobs, not going anywhere because they're afraid of failure. So I made myself look like a fool. I was okay with this, but this brought me here.
That's an incredible story. And that's also just incredible advice as well. Thanks very much for touching on that. But something I want to touch on again very quickly is the after action review. If we can touch just quickly on what that actually is and how you actually use that. So I think you already said it as well. You have a terrible interview and you go away, have a couple of beers, feel sorry for yourself, and you sort of know why the interview didn't go as you would like. But do you really sit down and really think about, the strategy and why it went bad or why it went well? But like, what's this after action review that you mentioned, and why is that an essential part of the interview process?
Yeah. The after, like, and this is life advice, right? We're talking about interviews. It's a great way to look at it, but this is true with anything, right? The after action review has to, it's basically two questions, right? What went well and how do I get more of that? And what went bad and how do I get less of that? And, with bad interviews, 9 times out of 10, the problem is a lack of rehearsal beforehand or an unknown question that you didn't have an answer to, right? And you'll notice that those two things are kind of related, because if you practice enough, then you're going to come up with your own questions, right? And so like the after action review is, well, man, that question just, I had no answer to it, right? Or I don't think I have the skills. Okay, let me address the skills question. You have the skills. I promise you have the skills. I don't care who it is. I promise something in your life has imparted to you some level of skills, unless, of course, it's something highly technical, right? Like, you have to have a master level of Python knowledge. Like, that's not a skill that someone who's waitressing has. But like, here's a very common interview question. Give me a time in which you had conflict with a coworker. How did you resolve it and what was the result? There's an interview question. And you have this person who's like, well, I love my job. I've never had conflict with a coworker. Really? You never had conflict with a coworker? You are a liar, right? And if you are in an interview and you tell me, like, oh, I never had conflict with a coworker, the interview's done as far as I'm concerned. You are no longer trustworthy, right? And so it's asking that question. So what went well? What went poorly? Well, I didn't have an answer. So how do I get less of that? I need to make sure I have an answer. So I need to come up with times in which that happened. I need to be self-reflective as to where I failed and where I didn't have the answer. And then how do I get more of it? Well, what went well? I answered some question well that the interviewer was like, yeah, that, right? How do I get that action out of him? And part of the after action review is like, it's an exercise in humility, really, because you're having to go back and look at your faults and failings. And no one likes that unless you're really in love with progress, right? Like, for me to look back, my wife and I have this conversation a lot, or like, she's like, how do you look at your faults and failings? It was like, well, because I'm in love with future Dylan, and present Dylan needs to do stuff now. And I remember I did this mock interview. It was a guy from he was with Vanguard Financial Group. And at the end of the interview, I asked him, it was a mock interview. So again, no job at the end of it. And I said to him, I said, would you have hired me? And he goes, absolutely not. And I like, okay, I'm like crushed because I have an ego, and that ego is fragile. And he ripped it into small pieces, lit it on fire, and then, peed it out. And I'm like, holding back tears. Why? And he broke down every question in excruciating detail. So like, if you fail at an interview, you don't get a job. Email that interviewer, because I guarantee you have their email, and say, hey, I'm really disappointed that I'm, I can't take advantage of this opportunity at the time. What could I have done to change your mind? And I will tell you that 90% of the time you won't hear anything. And then there'll be that one person who's bored on a Friday, and they'll email you back and they'll hand you the keys to the kingdom. But again, this goes back to that willingness to fail, right? And that guy from Vanguard, like, man, I thought about quitting the program after that because it was devastating. But I sat down and was like, okay, these are his criticism. I didn't follow the STAR format. If you go online, you can find the STAR format. A lot of interviewers use it. I'm not covering it here because if you're Googling anything, you're going to run into it.
Yeah.
Right. So all of my questions, he's like, you have too many stories. Okay. So limit my stories and my examples down to 3 stories max that can be applicable to multiple different situations. Right. So I can continue to reference them. And then of course, that's a technique to like get something to stick in that interviewer's mind by mentioning the same story multiple times. This guy from Vanguard gave me the keys to the kingdom. So that actually, what do I do when it didn't happen? Well, I would go talk to one of the alumni and say, hey, there's a guy, his name was Chris. He got the job I wanted. He was an older student just like me. And I called him up and I said, look, I'm going to drive down to Phoenix. And you name the restaurant and you have a blank check. All I want is your time and your brain. And I will pay for everything. He was expensive. He was very expensive, but he told me everything. Right. And I talked to him about interviews that I had done. And he was like, this is why that's a bad question. This is why this is how you failed. And so that after action review is a multifaceted thing. And if your audience is sitting there thinking, well, wow, that's a lot to do from one interview. No, I didn't do this for every interview. I did this bit by bit, piece by piece. I'd made small little votes every time I failed for the person I wanted to be. And I'm giving you the shotgun of here's the whole list, but that whole list took place over 5 years, right? That whole list took a long time to put together, and I'm way stronger now because of it. But that after action review is a small daily thing you do that's just building brick by brick.
Yeah. Thanks very much for sharing that. That's incredible. That's definitely, I don't envisage having to do a job interview for some time, thankfully, but that's something I'll definitely bear in mind when the time comes. So my next question, and this is going to be very broad, but it just covered the major parts of it. What are the biggest wins and mistakes you can make on a CV? The red flags and the absolute gold that an employer looks at and goes yes or no.
So let's start with the biggest mistake. I said I had an ego. I do have an ego. And therefore, my biggest mistake is I never asked for help for a long time.
Yeah.
This is like budgeting. Everybody thinks for some reason they should be good at making a resume. There is no God-given reason why anybody should be good at this esoteric, bureaucratic, functionary activity. So, just put the ego aside and ask for help. And my resumes got a lot better when I did this. The biggest thing I would say for a resume, though, is that, I'm going to tell your audience how to build a resume and then which one to use, right? You want to sit down with a resume, sit down, and this will take you 3 to 4 hours, I promise, and list out absolutely every skill you can possibly think of on a piece of paper and give an example for every single one of them, right? Project management. I was a waiter and I managed all these tables. Okay, there's project management. Financial management. I've been managing a budget for my church, right? And just start handing that out. Now, on the next section down is your education, of course, right? You list out your education, what your GPA was, where you got your degree, whatever, if you have that. If it's trade school, same deal, right? And then go through your jobs. And I want you to, in my case, I'm in my late 30s. I have like 10 pages of jobs because I've never stopped hustling. And for most of my life, I've worked multiple jobs at a time. But I list them all out. I list out, my teaching. And then I list out everything I did with that teaching, putting together curriculums, developing new classes, coaching wrestling, fundraising, all of it, everything. Bouncing. I bounced at a local theater when I was teaching because 1 month I was really, really short of money. One of my students' dads ran the music venue in town. I called him up and said, hey, I had his number from school, which I probably shouldn't have done, right? I was like, hey, I need extra money because you get any work I can do? He's like, I need a bouncer. Okay, so I bounced. Terrible job. Don't do that. Growing up on. Terrible. But the point being is I still put that down, right? And what did I learn there? Conflict de-escalation, multiple awareness, attention to detail, nothing else I could show up that I was willing to show up on time, right? And so once you have this, you're going to have this multi-page document, okay? And all that is a master resume. That is not what you hand into an employer. That's for you. So everybody tells you to tailor your resume, and this is where people burn out in this constant process. Remember, it's a volume game, right? Apply for everything, even if you're not interested in it. Get as much experience as possible. How do you do that without burning yourself out? Well, now I have a master resume. So in every job description, they're going to have bullet points of these are the skills we want. Here's the experience we want. Take their bullet points and your bullet points and compare. Copy and paste all of the bullet points from your master resume to a new sheet of paper that matches their bullet points and submit that. That is how you can take advantage of the volume game over and over and over again. The other thing I would say is that, once you have your master resume, you want to have this as polished as possible because, again, you're cutting and pasting. You're tailoring based upon what skills they ask for to what skills you have. Go ask a friend for help. Right. In my case, I went down to, her name was Wendy. She worked at the career development office at my university when I was going to be an accountant. I handed her my resume and she goes, this is terrible, and put it in the shredder.
All right.
like literally. And I'm sitting there like, I'm horrified. And she goes, the problem is that this resume tells me nothing. Right. And she went through and the resume I have is lovely. I'm very proud of it. But she helped me make it. And I would never have gotten there on my own if not going to that other person. My caveat is that there's a lot of crappy advice out on websites. And so like a good way to gauge whether or not you're getting good feedback is whether or not you feel terrible afterwards. Your resume is part of your ego. If we didn't actually do the work, you're not going to feel bad. So if you walk out of, if you hand this to your roommate, and your roommate's like, "Oh, I would hire you, bro." That you feel good by that, don't you?
Mm.
That you didn't get good advice. There was no iterative process. It does not feel good to go to the gym every day. It should not feel good to continue to work in your resume.
Yeah, that's that's very interesting. So that's like the hard stuff in the like putting pen to paper, but something maybe a bit more abstract, and I think this is a problem a lot of people have. So my question to you is how do you become a good communicator? Because I feel like a lot of people walk into the job and they are the most qualified people for this job, but whether it's nerves on the day or you're just not good at communicating, how do you articulate to an employer that you are the best candidate for this job, but how do you, with terrible communication skills, do that? Or if you're like 18 and you're confident you can do this job, whatever that may be, but like how do you foster good communication skills, and how do you communicate well on the day in the interview?
So I'm going to answer your question, and I guarantee you that someone in your audience is going to tell me that I'm a liar, and I'm not. Okay.
Okay.
But I'm going to start in a weird place. Do you watch sports, Jonathan?
Yes, I'm a big rugby fan.
Oh, I love rugby. I absolutely love the World Championship qualifiers. We're in Denver, and I got tickets, and it was amazing.
Oh yeah.
So you ever watch rugby practice?
Yes, believe it or not, for all the size of me, I did play rugby once upon a time. Yes.
You poor man, you.
Still in one piece.
Right? But stop and think about your rugby practice.
Mm.
You did the fundamentals every single day. They were boring, you didn't like them, and they weren't exciting, and nobody comes to watch it unless they're a hardcore rugby fan, right? Here in the US, you go watch the big baseball players, they're hitting off a tee. Right? How many times do basketball players just stand there from a particular spot on the court and just shoot 100 shots during practice? Right? In wrestling, when I wrestled in high school and in college, like we did the same move 100 times. So how do we become great wrestlers? How do we become great ruggers? How do we become great baseball players? You do the basic stuff over and over and over and over again. So when it comes to communication, you got to do the same thing. Why do we think that there's a different path to this? That somehow good communication is this natural thing? I will tell you that I've had, when I was I was in university and I was coaching people on how to do the interviews, and or even my buddy at work who was like, "Hey, I want to move to a different part of the organization. I don't know what skills I have as an auditor to be able to do this." Well, I work for power utility, so we have transmission lines for the electricity. And I said, "Well, but your job and your role as a CPA makes it so that you understand how capital allocation can add value to the company when we build new transmission lines." And he just looks at me and was like, "That was incredible. How did you do that?" Well, I've been practicing for years. And where did I practice? In the mirror.
Mm.
Like the best way to become a communicator is to walk up to a mirror. And this is where people tell me, like, you don't actually do this. Yes, I actually do this. And I've been doing it for years. You go and stand in front of a mirror, you look yourself in the eye, and you say the thing you want to say to somebody else. And this will do a number of different things. Number one, that's going to be uncomfortable as all get out. It's going to be like you're on fire, I promise. Because I'm an extroverted person, but like it's still scary to me. I still don't like to do it. And I've been doing it now for almost 20 years, right? And so like you say that, and it's going to help you get over those nerves, because if you are your worst critic, you know where all your bodies are buried, and you know your own BS. And so when you can deliver it to yourself, you're going to look amazing to everyone else because they don't know all the bad stuff. And the other thing about it is, if you can't look yourself in the eye and say something with conviction, then you yourself don't believe it. No one else will either. So when you're doing your interview questions, get your interview questions and interview to yourself in the mirror. you will know how that person on the other side of the table looks at you. And when you believe you, when you would hire you, then you're ready.
Wow, that's yeah. I definitely didn't learn that in school. You touched on the fact that you actually helped coach people through interviews. What would be the one bit of advice, or what was the one consistent piece of advice that you gave um, to your students, or have you potentially already covered it in this chat?
I mean, it's one of these things where I've already covered it a bunch, but it's worth saying again. You got to practice,
Just
right?
practice, yeah.
You got to practice. It's time on target. This is a volume game. You have to practice. And how do you practice? Practice at the grocery store. Strike up a conversation with the person behind you and practice your communication skills. Practice your gravitas. Practice how you're delivering. Practice looking people in the eye. Be nice to the person at the gas station. Say hi to someone on local transit.
Mm.
You know, go out of your way to say something profound to your partner, roommate, or wife, right? You know, call up a stranger, a friend you haven't talked to in a while, and just strike up a conversation and practice small talk. You know, a big goal for me this quarter is, like, I'm an intense person, right? I'm all business, and I know that, and I'm working very hard because I want to be a manager at my company. So I got to learn small talk. This is a new place for me, right? So I'm learning how to talk about sports. I'm learning, but how do I do that? I talk to everybody, right? And so, you know, the one reframe that I had for everyone I was coaching for interviews is practice, 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 practice in the mirror, practice with your cat, practice with a rubber duck. Like, once you say it out loud, you'll hear it and you'll get your own feedback.
Yeah.
And it sounds crazy. People are like, well, I don't want to be a crazy man talking to the duck. You're only crazy if the duck talks back. Okay.
Very good.
So like it's low stakes. You record yourself. We're talking on Zoom. We have this technology. Record yourself and play it back. Do you believe you? Because if not, then they're not going to believe you either.
Yeah, that's really good. So what I would like to do now actually is we do have a question from the audience. A big shout out to my brother Robbie for actually coming up with this question. So his question is, he'd like to understand tailoring a CV and interview to the nature of job or job sector. So the example being a more HR based CV. From university really like he submitted a CV to an HR person in university and they loved it, said it was great. However, when he went to an engineering firm, one of the guys was very nice and actually reviewed his CV prior to um not the company he was actually going to, but another engineering guy reviewed it and said this is terrible. Like this CV is made for someone in HR to read and go, this is wonderful. This tells me nothing. Like you need to tailor your. He said you need to tailor your CV to HR, tailor your CV to engineering. But they wanted to know for the guys in engineering, they wanted to know how can you provide value to them over we don't care what you do in your spare time. So what's your advice and what's your experience in this area of tailoring CVs?
So your brother's name is Robbie?
Yeah.
Robbie, I love your question. Like,
I like that.
I like this is a wonderful question. And I had to learn this the hard way going from education to accounting, because that's exactly the difference between what you're calling an HR resume and your engineering resume is exactly the same difference between education and accounting. And I'm going to answer this question in a broad way that's applicable to everything. The question, how you answer that question, is entirely dependent on one thing. How does the organization you're trying to be part of do their stuff? Okay. And I notice I didn't say how they make their money, because not-for-profits, governmental organizations don't make money, right? That they're not profit. So if you're applying for a government job, if you're applying for an education job, like my school was not out to make a profit. They were out to educate kids. So how did that school do the thing? That school did the thing by interpersonal relationships between the teachers and the students. Okay. And so my ability to connect with the students and connect with the parents and connect with the coworkers, to draw lines between the abstract mathematical concepts to the real world, that was what was valuable to a school. And so my resume for my education has all of my hobbies on it. It has my other interests, different traveling things. It tells a more holistic part of who I am as a person, so that I can reference those things inside of an interview. For example, I've been scuba diving for years. My parents owned a scuba diving shop, and that's where I picked this up, right? So I have a lot of experience with that. I don't put that on my accounting resume, but I do put it on my education resume. Why? Because I can talk about this real world application for this algebra and connect it to these kids and what might be interesting to them, right? That's how the school adds its value. My accounting firms do not care. They want to know that I'm good at data analytics. They want to know I'm good at managing projects. They want to know that I'm good at staying under budget and delivering early, because that's how they make their money. Education is about teaching. Accounting is about making money. We do this for the money. So that engineering firm you're talking about is exactly the same thing. They want to know how you can help them do the thing that they want to do. And so if you're looking at how do I tailor my resume, that's the question you have to ask. How does this organization do the thing that they want to do? And what type of person would they need to do that? And so the advice you got from the engineers is perfect for what you're looking for. If you are trying to get into a technical field, you got to talk about your technical expertise, because that's how they do their thing. If you want to get into a softer field like social work or education, sales, whatever, that's all the squishy stuff, right? So you put the squishy stuff in your resume.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks very much for that. We're coming up on to an hour here, so that's all I wanted to chat about. But folks, you will be glad to know that Dylan will be a repeat guest on this podcast. In the future, he's going to cover other valuable skills such as how to professionally network, when is the correct time to change career. So you can all look forward to that in the future of this podcast. Dylan, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to discuss this really, really important topic. Where can the listeners find you if they want to hear more about you or your content?
Yeah, they can come and find me. I run a side hustle on a podcast called Fiscally Savage. So you can check me out at Fiscally Savage on Instagram and Twitter. Find me at any of the podcasting places at Fiscally Savage, or come and visit me at fiscallysavage.com.
Yeah, I can highly recommend that podcast. Got lots of great content to keep you right in your financials. Dylan, once again, thank you so much. I've really appreciated this chat.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure.